Several times through this A Song of Failures and Hope sermon series, and multiple times in blogs I've written, we've talked about the idea of promise and payoff. Specifically when it comes to writing stories, the author alludes to or hints at some upcoming event, a foreshadowing of betrayal, a shadowy figure that will eventually be revealed as the next ally. Sometimes it's even a prophecy that clues the reader into future events. With quite a number of these hinted promises, the payoff is something that we want, like the seed for amazing character development, or a power upgrade that doesn't come out of nowhere, all Deus Ex Machina style. The payoff makes us leap up and cheer. Cap-wielding Mjolnir, anyone? But with other narrative promises, the payoff is less desirable. We know that someone going on one last mission with the pocket holding a proposal ring is not going to make it out of this one alive. And we also know that overconfidence is a surefire way to fall into humiliation. And then there are stories where we know that a price will need to be paid. Someone's got to die or sacrifice themselves. It's even worse when the payoff leaves someone scarred, whether physically, emotionally, or psychologically. We can eventually come to accept a person's death if they sacrificed themselves. But if it was the killing off of a protagonist's love interest in order to emotionally wound them, or the defilement of their person, then the payoff leaves us cringing and closing our eyes in retreat. They're payoffs that we wish had not been promised. We'd rather have a happily ever after than whatever horror just emerged out of the mire. And I'm sure that the vast majority of non-sadistic authors don't like those payoffs either. They'd prefer to just let their characters be perfect little darlings the whole time. But the truth is that there would be no growth and no story if they were to only give happy payoffs to their promises. And I believe the same is true of the author of our reality. God is good and pure and holy. I am sure that he would have preferred that Adam and Eve had never sinned in the garden, and that humanity had never become this broken, marred, and scarred image of him that we have become because of sin. But because he lovingly offered us free will in the midst of his divinely willed creation, the problems of this life brought about by human evil became a possible payoff. There are parts of God's plan, his prophetic promises, that leave us with those payoffs that we want to run away from. They are as a result of human evil choosing an ungodly direction, but God can still use them for the good of his humble people. We won't like it in the moment, and some people will throw events like these in the face of anyone claiming that God is good, while they conveniently forget that the whole reason for those disastrous results was because of the sin of humanity. While we should never revel in the darker aspects of these unwanted payoffs, we should still be willing to see the good that God has in them, despite them. I mean, he is the God who suffered death on a cross for us, also that he could lead us to the resurrected life. So it's not like he hasn't experienced this human reality himself, suffered at its hands. I say all of this by way of introduction because there are a lot of disastrous payoffs in our passage for this sermon. 2 Samuel chapter 16, verse 15 to chapter 17, verse 23. Fulfillment of a bunch of things from previous chapters going all the way back to chapters 11 and 12. Remember, this whole Absalom section of David's story arc is as a result of David's adultery with Bathsheba and the murder of her husband Uriah the Hittite. And we're not even covering the culmination of the Absalom section yet. I mean, we're still on the same day of David's life that we've been talking about for the past 2 sermons. The same day. As we look at this passage and see payoff after payoff, let's remember to put the blame of their horrors on the evil choices of human free will, while we also focus in on the amazing work of God in the passage. How he uses these terrible circumstances to work his good will into the lives of his humble people. It's a dichotomy that is difficult to hang on to, one that we won't want to, but it is a dichotomy that is necessary for this passage for us to understand it, and much of life, to be honest. So let's begin this lengthy passage with the first of its 7 scenes, as we see God faithfully pay off a plan that David made 2 sermons ago. 2 Samuel chapter 16, verses 15 to 19. Now Absalom and all the people, the men of Israel, came to Jerusalem, and Ahithophel with him. And when Hushai the Archite, David's friend, came to Absalom, Hushai said to Absalom, "Long live the king! Long live the king!" And Absalom said to Hushai, "Is this your loyalty to your friend? Why did you not go with your friend?" And Hushai said to Absalom, "No, for whom the Lord and the people and all the men of Israel have chosen, his I will be, and with him I will remain. And again, whom should I serve? Should it not be his son? As I have served your father, so I will serve you." In chapter 15, we witnessed Absalom encourage others to crown him king, and then he'd begun his march from Hebron to Jerusalem, less than 20 miles away. News of that fact had met David, and so he and his family and their servants retreated from the capital. And if you remember, one of the friendly people who followed after David was his advisor Hushai. Technically, Hushai's title was Friend of David or Friend of the King. The title indicated the closeness of king and advisor. But David had sent Hushai back to Jerusalem in order to thwart the advice of Ahithophel, who had joined Absalom. Ahithophel was the incredibly wise advisor who once served David faithfully, and also happened to be Bathsheba's grandfather, which I believe explains the reason why he had joined Absalom's side of this revolution. So Hushai had quite the task ahead of him, having to thwart Ahithophel's advice. But God was with David through Hushai, because of David's prayer for God to muddle the advice of Ahithophel. When we see Hushai acting as mole in Absalom's court, we must keep in mind that God uses the advisor's words to faithfully answer, to pay off, that prayer of David. And we saw at the end of chapter 15 that Hushai had arrived at Jerusalem just in time to usher in the arrival of Absalom. And now in verse 15 of chapter 16, we catch back up to Hushai's greeting of Absalom. It's actually kind of amazing to see the tact with which Hushai played his part as mole and advice muddier. As Absalom approaches, Hushai proclaims, "Long live the king! Long live the king!" But he never intones the idea that Absalom was the king he was wishing long life toward. David might have fled the capital, but he was still the king. Long may he reign, Hushai thought. Hushai just let Absalom's pride in his usurped title do the heavy lifting in convincing the self-proclaimed king that the advisor was talking about him. And I'm sure that Hushai gave a warm chuckle at Absalom's wordplay toward the king's advisor. Not much of a friend, are you, O friend of the king? Title's not living up to your actions, Hushai. Little did Absalom know how much of a friend Hushai actually was being towards David. In response to the jab, Hushai declares truth, which he once again allows Absalom's pride to color in the unspoken details. The loyalty of an advisor is to the king whom Yahweh has chosen and whom the people choose. We all know that God had not chosen Absalom to be king over Israel. It was Absalom alone who had grasped at that role. It was not given to him. So Hushai truthfully states that he works for God's chosen king. It just so happens that this is David, not Absalom, regardless of how the prince-turned-usurper heard those words. However, Hushai continues, "If the son of the king were indeed the king whom Yahweh chose to reign after David, then would it not be right for his advisor to also give counsel to the new king? And so, because Hushai served David, he would stand before Absalom." The Hebrew is actually nebulous in Hushai's meaning, more so than our translations read. Hushai never promised to serve Absalom, but to be before him, because Hushai served David. It's amazing wisdom on the part of Hushai to speak truth with just enough ambiguity, while allowing Absalom's pride to trap the usurping king. Of course, we can't downplay the role of God in this moment. He occasionally works in human history to nudge people toward their own foolishness, just like he does for Absalom here. Hushai's words could have been taken by Absalom for what they were in reality. But in a joint working of God's sovereign push and Absalom's prideful self-delusion, the interpretation allowed Hushai to be there to disrupt Ahithophel's advice. At least, disrupt it in moments where it was necessary for the aid of David. I say it that way because the rest of the verses of chapter 16 show Ahithophel giving advice that Hushai does not speak against, or at least doesn't give counsel against. And I'm going to be honest, I highly doubt that Hushai backed this action, because very few godly people would. But Ahithophel's upcoming advice isn't good, morally speaking. Yet it does pay off one of those unwanted promises made to David back in chapter 12. But I think I've delayed reading the verses for as long as I can. So let's look at 2 Samuel chapter 16, verses 20 to 23. Then Absalom said to Ahithophel, "Give your counsel, what shall we do?" Ahithophel said to Absalom, "Go into your father's concubines, whom he has left to keep the house, and all Israel will hear that you have made yourself a stench to your father, and the hands of all who are with you will be strengthened." So they pitched a tent for Absalom on the roof, and Absalom went into his father's concubines in the sight of all Israel. Now in those days the counsel that Ahithophel gave was as if one consulted the word of God. So was all the counsel of Ahithophel esteemed, both by David and by Absalom. I myself am also having trouble seeing the words in that last verse in light of the preceding advice. But let's trust that it's there for a reason, and talk this through. Back in chapter 12, God had spoken through Nathan the prophet about God's displeasure with David's adultery. Part of the consequences of David's sin, even though he had repented, was that God would allow someone else to defile David's wives. Just like how David had sundered a marriage with this act of selfish pleasure, so too would another defile the marital bed of David. Only God would make sure that this act was done in public. All would see evidence of what David had tried to hide. And I don't know how much more public you can be than doing it on the roof of the palace. On the very roof that David had first lusted after Bathsheba. I'm sure there are questions rising in us about how God could allow 10 concubines, 10 women who had been used in political marriages, to be raped. And how could that be part of God's plan? What is good and godly about that despicable action? And this is where we must go back to what I said in the introduction. God had promised disaster upon David and the wives who would be defiled by another. But it was not a promise that he ever liked, that he ever called good. It was a consequence of sin. David's sin first and foremost, yes, but also Absalom's sin for allowing his pride to convince him that this was the thing that kings do. Remember, Absalom's schism with his father had to do with how David had interacted with Amnon's rape of Tamar. It was disgust at the injustice against an innocent girl's rape that led to all of this. Yet now Absalom forces himself sexually onto 10 women. He just lived long enough to see himself become the villain. The advice of Ahithophel sounded good to Absalom, because this was the type of thing that other kings in other nations did. The harems of previous kings always went to their successors. And kings who had forcibly taken the throne from the predecessor would often force themselves onto those women, to prove how this new king was now in charge. Absalom was doing what every other king did. Selfish, sinful kings who seek power by any means necessary. But it is not what God's chosen king does. Because the kingship over God's people is not something to be grasped at. Rather, it is given freely by God and held loosely as the king seeks to serve the justice of God. This leads us back to the question of how this terrible deed on the roof could be both a payoff to God's promise in chapter 12, but also not something that he condones. How this can be an unwanted payoff. Again, it's the evil choices of human beings that bring about these horrible events. God can use them for his purposes, like showing us how our sins can lead us to more and more suffering in the lives of others. But we must remember that God always prefers that we not sin, that we not bring suffering into the lives of others because of our choices that seemed in the moment to not hurt anybody else. Our selfishness always hurts others, whether we see it or not. I mean, think about this line of events from David's life. David chose to not go with his troops, which led to his lusting on the roof, which led to his sexual gratification with Bathsheba, whether or not she willingly chose to go along with it. This then led to David feeling like he could not speak into the lives of his children when they performed similar sins, both the sexual sin and murder. And because of that silence, Absalom pursued his own wrongful sense of justice, which he now seeks to impose upon the people of God, including imposing himself upon 10 innocent women. What started off as a little secret behind closed doors had led to the destruction of multiple families and a full-blown civil war in the nation. There is no such thing as a victimless selfishness. No such thing as a victimless sin. Our selfish sins might not lead to such vast swaths of people being affected, but there will always be someone hurt by our own selfishness. A terrible payoff to the promise of sin's consequence. God is faultless in this because these are the consequences of humanity's evil choices. Yes, he made the world in which these choices are made, but the only other option would be to remove human free will, and that would be far less loving of him, which is why Jesus was sent in flesh and humanity to pay for the sins. He's our only way to freedom from our selfishness, our only hope to find restoration in the midst of the problems of this life, the good that God brings about in the midst of all of this horror. In order for Absalom to be thwarted from his pursuit of the throne, God allowed him to fall deeper into his selfishness, to become like the villain that Absalom had once murdered, all to become the stench in David's eyes, so that God could show his people the type of restoration that God brings. This is why God didn't allow this terrible advice of Ahithophel to be muddied. We might not like it. God doesn't either. But such are the consequences of sin. We should keep that in mind when we're tempted toward our own selfish desires. The main reason why verse 23 is placed in the passage is to show us the greatness of God's work in the events of these first few verses of chapter 17. Because the next scene shows us actually good advice, both morally and politically, if it hadn't been aimed at David. 2 Samuel chapter 17 verses 1 to 4. Moreover, Ahithophel said to Absalom, "Let me choose 12,000 men, and I will arise and pursue David tonight. I will come upon him while he is weary and discouraged, and throw him into a panic, and all the people who are with him will flee. I will strike down only the king, and I will bring all the people back to you as a bride comes home to her husband. You seek the life of only one man, and all the people will be at peace. And the advice seemed right in the eyes of Absalom and all the elders of Israel. Now, I'm not sure if this third scene happened after the vile act of the previous scene, or if Ahithophel spoke to Absalom while that roof tent was being pitched. But either way, this advice from Ahithophel comes quickly on the heels of the previous, and it was tactically sound. David had only just fled the capital that very same day, unprepared and with very little warning, and they were hardly all battle-hardened soldiers who were with David. Sure, many of them were, but there were women and children with David who'd possibly never even been outside of the city. That mass of people would hardly be moving quickly or efficiently, and could easily be overtaken. Therefore, Ahithophel's advice was that he'd only need to take a small portion of the army, one troop from each of the tribes, to overtake David. And they wouldn't even all be necessary. All that Ahithophel needed to do was surgically remove David from the equation. The death of one man could end the civil war the very same day it started, and Ahithophel was more than willing to kill the man who'd defiled his granddaughter. The elder advisor even said that he would bring the people back to the king like a woman returning in glory to her husband. It was good advice, and would likely work. The people wouldn't have reason to hate their new king if he kept the bloodshed to a minimum, and the transfer of power would have had very few questions. Absalom and the elders loved the idea. It sounded good, like so much of Ahithophel's advice had. But what happened next could only be accredited to God's payoff for David's prayer earlier that day, because Absalom also calls for Hushai's advice. Why ask for a second opinion when you have amazing advice that you love? Why do it? So that God can continue to pay off his promises to David, by giving Hushai a chance to refute the value of Ahithophel's advice. 2 Samuel chapter 17, verses 5 to 10. Then Absalom said, Call Hushai the Archite also. Let us hear what he has to say. And when Hushai came to Absalom, Absalom said to him, Thus has Ahithophel spoken. Shall we do as he says? If not, speak. Then Hushai said to Absalom, This time the counsel that Ahithophel has given is not good. Hushai said, You know that your father and his men are mighty men, and that they are enraged like a bear robbed of her cubs in the field. Besides, your father is expert in war. He will not spend the night with the people. Behold, even now he has hidden himself in one of the pits or in some other place. And as soon as some of the people fall at the first attack, whoever hears it will say, There has been a slaughter among the people who follow Absalom. Then even the valiant men, whose heart is like the heart of a lion, will utterly melt with fear. For all Israel knows that your father is a mighty man, and that those who are with him are valiant men. I don't know what Ahithophel's face looked like when Absalom called for Hushai's second opinion, but I assure you it was not pleased. And when Hushai arrived, Absalom seemed to expect that the pair of advisors would agree. But because God was fulfilling the payoff to David's prayer, they obviously did not agree. And again, Hushai's words are filled with tact. He said that this time the counsel of Ahithophel is not good. He doesn't call into question the value of every other piece of Ahithophel's advice. No, he basically just says that Ahithophel had been away from David long enough that he'd forgotten certain parts of what made David into the formidable person that he was. As well, Hushai continues to prod at Absalom's pride. You know yourself, O Absalom, what your father is like. He's a formidable warrior who has a special forces unit with him. What does your royal mind consider will happen when those men, whose strength and fury you know so well, meet this paltry force that Ahithophel desires to lead? Besides, does the father you know seem like the kind of general to sleep among the troops? Have any of the stories that you have been told from childhood ever shown him to be anything but wise in his tactics? Even when hard-pressed in difficult circumstances? Use the wisdom that runs in your family to see how foolish Ahithophel's words are. All that will happen is victory for your father. Those troops that Ahithophel calls for will fall handily before your father's troops. And do you think that the people of Israel would ever follow a king who couldn't even take victory in his first battle? Especially when he has the advantage like you have, Absalom? No, it won't be your father's men who melt away, but those who follow you. This is not the best move for you. Throughout all of Hushai's words, he continues to stroke Absalom's ego. Quite often in Hebrew, the you referring to Absalom is emphatic. You yourself know this. The intentionally bad advisor tries, and succeeds, to use the vain and prideful weakness of Absalom in order to aid David in this civil war. It wouldn't be enough for Hushai to outright deny Ahithophel's wisdom. Everyone knew that the elder advisor gave counsel beyond compare. But God used the wisdom of Hushai and the foolish pride of Absalom to set the faintest wedge between the usurper king and his wisest advisor. All it took was trying to get Absalom to think for himself. We've been following Absalom for chapters now, and the closest thing we have to cunning from him was to lure his brother that he hated to his house in order to kill him. And remember, the secret code phrase that his servants had been given in order to do the deed was, "Strike Amnon." He's a bit more of a blunt instrument than sharply cunning. All Hushai had to do was muddy the waters. But poking holes in Absalom's wisdom was not enough. He also had to give advice that sounded good despite how terrible it was. And so the counsel that Hushai provided continued to prey on Absalom's selfish pride. As if Ahithophel had only been interested in his own glory, stolen from the hands of the person to whom it should belong, at least in Absalom's eyes. 2 Samuel chapter 17, verses 11 to 14. But my counsel is that all Israel should be gathered to you, from Dan to Beersheba, as the sand by the sea for multitude, and that you go to battle in person. So we shall come upon him in some place where he is to be found, and we shall light upon him as the dew falls on the ground. And of him and all the men who are with him not one will be left. If he withdraws into a city, then all Israel will bring ropes to that city, and we shall drag it into the valley until not even a pebble is to be found there. And Absalom and all the men of Israel said, The counsel of Hushai the Archite is better than the counsel of Ahithophel. For the Lord had ordained to defeat the good counsel of Ahithophel, so that the Lord might bring harm upon Absalom. Hushai basically asks, who's going to get the glory if Ahithophel leads the army? Only Ahithophel's going to get that. But we don't want that. No, you, Absalom, you should lead the army yourself. Get the glory for you. Be at the head of your own sea of warriors. Again, it is to Absalom's pride that God presses through Hushai's words, preying upon the delusions of grandeur that have long played in Absalom's head. Not only will this cause Absalom to be out in the field of battle, with a chance to die on it, but also waiting for all of Israel to muster troops will give time to David and those with him. Remember, David's plan was to wait at a specific location until the sons of Zadok and Abiathar, the priests, gave him word from the spies. This includes information about Absalom's battle plan from Hushai. So Hushai needs to buy time for David to get word and then move out. Therefore, getting Absalom to picture a horde of Israelites behind him is necessary, because mustering that number of troops will not be easy or fast. It'll give David the time that he needs to escape. Speed really is the best tactic for Absalom's side, so slowing him down will usher in his defeat. Verse 14 speaks directly to the hidden movements of God in all of this. Yahweh himself wants to see the downfall of this usurper who placed himself on the throne that God alone has the right to fill, and also because of his payoff to the promises he made to David. The author of all things hints at a new promise amidst all of these payoffs. Absalom will fall. David will once again reign. And just like it was with Saul, David won't be the one to stretch out his hand to take the throne. No, God will give it back to him. He will be faithful to the king who said that very same day in history, which we saw back in chapter 15, that if Yahweh found favor in David once again, he'd bring him back to this city. This is the faithfulness of God, bringing restoration amidst the problems of this life. He never promises a life of ease to those who follow him, but he does promise restoration to his humble people. That faithfulness includes both his chosen king and those who serve him, like the priestly sons who now need to tell David about all of these happenings. 2 Samuel chapter 17, verses 15 to 22. Then Hushai said to Zadok and Abiathar the priests, Thus and so did Ahithophel counsel Absalom and the elders of Israel, and thus and so have I counseled. Now therefore send quickly and tell David, Do not stay tonight at the fords of the wilderness, but by all means pass over, lest the king and all the people who are with him be swallowed up. Now Jonathan and Ahimaaz were waiting in En-Rogel. A female servant was to go and tell them, and they were to go and tell King David, for they were not to be seen entering the city. But a young man saw them and told Absalom. So both of them went away quickly and came to the house of a man at Bahurim, who had a well in his courtyard. And they went down into it, and the woman took and spread a covering over the well's mouth and scattered grain on it, and nothing was known of it. When Absalom's servants came to the woman in the house, they said, Where are Ahimaaz and Jonathan? The woman said to them, They have gone over the brook of water. And when they had sought and could not find them, they returned to Jerusalem. After they had gone, the men came up out of the well, and went and told King David. They said to David, "Arise and go quickly over the water, for thus and so has Ahithophel counseled against you." Then David arose, and all the people who were with him, and they crossed the Jordan. By daybreak not one was left who had not crossed the Jordan. Although Hushai had given the best advice that he could, it was ultimately up to Absalom what to do. And Hushai was not privy to verse 14's words. Quite often, the faithful work of God happens in times and places that we can't see. So we must trust him to work, even as we try to figure it all out. So Hushai tells Jonathan and Ahimaaz the details of both advisors' counsel. Either way, David's got to move. But if Ahithophel's counsel is taken, then haste is not fast enough. The pair of priestly sons were waiting in a nearby town to hear word from the spies. But when they were about to move out, the story's tension rises because a servant of Absalom saw them. The servant had to get the attention of Absalom's people before following. But the head start that the pair of priestly sons had was not much. They only got to the very same town where that cursing Benjamite from the last sermon lived. He might still be on his way back from cursing out David, but we don't know for sure. Regardless, the priest's sons find an ally with a well in their inner courtyard. No one could see it unless deeper into their property. And in that well was where the pair were hidden, with a tarp over the top of the well, and a few seeds scattered over it to make it look like there was nothing there. None of Absalom's men would be knowledgeable enough of the area to know that there used to be a well here. The whole scene of two godly spies being hidden by a woman while the enemy searched for them is reminiscent of Rahab hiding the spies in Jericho back in the time of the conquest for Canaan. Apparently, God also uses tropes in his storytelling of his faithfulness in our reality. Anyway, once the pursuers realize that their trail has gone cold, the pair of priest's sons make their way to David and tell him everything that's been going on. They gotta move. Now! God is faithful to David yet again, allowing for the counsel to reach his ears. And also in the fact that Absalom would take Hushai's advice. By the time the next morning came, there was not a single person in David's entourage left behind. God had been faithful. But there is one last scene that we must see. And although it is only one verse, we see how God continually remains faithful to his humble people. Here, by taking out one more enemy of David. 2 Samuel chapter 17, verse 23. When Ahithophel saw that his counsel was not followed, he saddled his donkey and went off to his own city. He set his house in order and hanged himself, and he died and was buried in the tomb of his father. It wasn't just Absalom's pride that was played upon. Pride in his own wisdom caused Ahithophel to not take this rejection well, and the fact that he probably foresaw the outcome of Absalom's foolishness didn't help him either. So Ahithophel, who seemed to have been Absalom's big gun, ended his own life. He'd betrayed God's chosen king, and now, out of grief, hanged himself. It reminds me of another man who had been close to God's chosen king, had betrayed him, and hanged himself out of grief, Judas Iscariot. The payoff to long foretold promises isn't always wanted, but if God is the one authoring the payoff, then we know that good news of restoration is not far away. God is faithful to his humble people, even in the midst of the actions of human evil. Yes, we'll have to suffer the consequences of sin, both ours and that of others. Dark times will beset us because of the ramifications of all sorts of sin, but God remains faithful, readily nudging the actions of humanity toward his plan of restoration. Remember that God's greatest act of bringing restoration to his humble people came as he used the consequence of sin called death as a part of his amazing plan. Death on a cross. Unwanted payoffs, the consequences of freely chosen human evils, will come into our lives. But even they do not have the power to thwart the plan of God and his chosen king. Whatever the problems are in our life right now, they won't overcome God's plan in bringing us restoration. Even if we're running for our lives for the millionth time, know that God will show his favor to those who are his humble people. And that is one payoff that we can stand and cheer for.